Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this conference about the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, competitors in the jihadist scenario. It's a conference that has come about from the collaboration of Casa Asia and the Club de Madrid. We are very pleased today to be able to work in cooperation with other institutions, both in Madrid and within the Iberian region, and even the European area, and on the other side of the Atlantic, to put together our strengths and being able to bring specialists here to generate a debate and a productive analysis. First of all, I would like to invite Teresa Gutiérrez del Álamo, who is the director of the Centro de Casa Asia in Madrid, to give us an introduction of today. Our houses share many problems and we share the same concerns. Thank you, Teresa.
Bueno, después de esta
after this brief, unfortunate event with a gadget, I'm afraid I tend to have problems with cybernetic and electronic things. I'm very used to it. So I would like to thank Casa Árabe for having me here today in this wonderful auditorium and to hold such an interesting panel as the one that we are having here today. Ahmed Rashid, for those of you, well, of course, I wanted to thank Ruben, who is here with us, and the Club de Madrid, that they have facilitated and made it possible that Mr. Ahmed Rashid is here with us today. He is widely known by all the people who are interested in the Al-Qaeda world. He is the great expert in Al-Qaeda, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and especially also the Taliban. So since the beginning of the conflict in the region, with Al-Qaeda, he's also an expert in Al-Qaeda. We were talking before about those times where the world seemed an easy place to live in, and although there were many conflicts in the world, we knew what Al-Qaeda was, where the Taliban were, and what was going on with Pakistan. It was a disaster, it was painful, and it caused great insecurity in the world. But if we compare it with what we have today, the truth is that we have taken steps forward into a more complex and worse reality. When I saw the title of this conference, it's true, the Taliban are still there, and so is Al-Qaeda, but we have forgotten about them. What has contributed to us forgetting them? It's the birth of the Daesh. Maybe many experts who worked on this topic not so long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, they might have thought that Daesh, or back then the search for the creation of the Khalifa state, they would not be of great concern for the Western world. It was mostly seen as a conflict within the Middle East, mainly because of the fight between the Shiites and the Sunnis. But nobody expected that very shortly after, the Daesh would even make Al-Qaeda seem like a non-important problem for all of us who are on this side of on the other side of the Mediterranean area. It's very interesting that a person such as Ahmed Rashid can explain for us today where they are, where Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are right now at this moment, and where where is the Afghanistan and Pakistan problem lying nowadays? Because this is still an underlying problem and it still has a long future. So thank you to the Casa Árabe and everyone who has facilitated this encounter, and I hope that you find it interesting. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Teresa. Voy a hacer una breve
I'm going to give you a brief introduction, after which we will start with. I will give the floor to Mr. Rashid, and afterwards Ms. Requena will also have the floor, and we will listen to Rubén Campos, who is the coordinator of the agenda for Club de Madrid, before we pass on to the QA area. First of all, a matter that is important for a Spanish speaker is if we can use the word Talibans in the future with an S at the end. I checked around and everybody, all the experts in the language know that they agree that we can use the plural form of this word. And let's talk about them in depth. 20 years ago, they sieged Kabul and they established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. This emirate was acknowledged by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And Al-Qaeda also helped them out with fighters coming from different countries, Arab countries like in Central Asia and the nearby Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had arrived about 10 years earlier than the Taliban. It was founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam. Their origins date from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. These mujahideens also had the help from the United States to fight the Soviets. They are ideologically intolerant to other interpretations of Islam beyond the Salafist Jihadist. They have been named a terrorist group by the Security Council of the United Nations, the NATO, the European Union states, Russia, India, and other countries. After the death of bin Laden, it is under the lead of Ahmad al-Zawahiri. And now we arrive at the self-proclaimed Islamic State, also known as Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, etc. Daesh made the headlines in 2014 after the fall of Mosul and the Sinjar massacre. In Syria, they have performed many ground attacks against the government forces, and by the beginning of 2015, CIA considered that there must have been about 31,000 fighters in Iraq and Syria, out of which two-thirds would be foreigner fighters, whereas the Daesh leaders, they claim that they send about 40,000 fighters, most of them being Syrian and from Iraq. From 1996, the Taliban do not intend to go beyond the borders of Afghanistan. However, Al-Qaeda and Daesh are looking for a caliphate state, although their means are different. The Al-Qaeda is more center-bound, although they have different branches in the Maghreb and Middle East. But the Daesh are like the advanced students that outperformed the teachers by being more bloodthirsty than the first ones. The presence of Daesh in the media doesn't mean that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are almost extinct. Their strategies and the fighters are continuously changing and mutating in their tactics according to their gaining or losing land, and their international counterparts are reacting to their actions. In Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, the Sahel region, and Sinai, and also Afghanistan and Pakistan are the prey to this harsh fights between these extremist groups who profit from the weaknesses of the states, and the victims are everywhere in all continents, including the European ones. So studying their evolution is a very important exercise. So before I give the floor to Ahmed Rashid, I would like to point out that you have his books on sale here at the bookstore in the Casa Árabe, as is the Pilar Requena's book on Afghanistan. And also I would like you to invite you to visit at the Conde Duque Art Center the exhibition on women in Afghanistan with photographs by Mr. Gervasio Sanchez. And this is an on-look on Afghanistan that seems to be somewhat outside the press and the TV news and the TV channels, because they're not so current, or they don't seem so current in the face of the Syrian conflict, but still is important to understand the jihadism nowadays. So thank you very much, Mr. Rashid, Ms. Requena, and I give the floor to Mr. Rashid now.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And let me thank Casa Árabe and Casa Asia, who have helped me over the years promote my translations of my books in Spanish, and also Club de Madrid. It's very good that all of you have managed to get together, and there is such a large audience. And I'm very happy to see so many young people take an interest in these issues. Let me just say a few words about Syria. The events in Syria are showing the virtual collapse of the international order. We are faced with a global crisis in Syria, and the fact that the Russians and the Syrians are insisting on continuing to bomb Aleppo and the civilians, not allowing humanitarian aid, it is an absolute catastrophe for diplomacy, for the international community, and of course for Syria and the civilians. The external interference in the civil war in Syria has escalated and shows no sign of abating. Ultimately, this will only strengthen the extremists and the Islamic extremists. Multiple militant groups are now fighting in Syria, and multiple countries and patrons are supplying them with weapons and ammunition and money. And there's such a deep now involvement of so many countries involved. For example, for Assad, we have Afghans who are fighting for Assad, Iranians, Pakistanis, who are all being enlisted by Iran to fight for Assad. And on the other side, we of course have ISIS and other international groups. So I'm really deeply concerned that the international community seems to have abandoned human dignity and compassion for what is happening. All this is a reminder of the war in Afghanistan. Let us remember, the Syrian war has gone on for 5 years. The war in Afghanistan started in 1979 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. But how easily we have almost forgotten about Afghanistan since the withdrawal of NATO, including Spanish troops, the withdrawal of NATO, and over 100,000 American troops who were unable to stop the civil war and defeat the Taliban. Now, I fear very much that Afghanistan is falling apart, and it creates enormous problems for the future. And let me, first of all, why is this happening? The Americans and NATO countries have spent billions, at least $1 trillion over 15 years in Afghanistan. Well, why this is happening, I'll give you a few reasons. The first is that the US forces left Afghanistan with only a half-trained Afghan army. The Afghan army has very poor logistics, it has no medical facilities, it has no air force, and depends on American aircraft to bomb Taliban positions. Last year, 5,000 Afghan soldiers were killed in the war, and 12,000 were wounded. Now, even according to an American general, this is unsustainable. You cannot sustain these losses for more than a year or two, because the army will then collapse. The second reason is that there is huge government disunity. As you know, it is a coalition government. There were elections 2 years ago which were heavily rigged, and for 6 months there was neither side would accept defeat. Eventually the Americans came in and put together a coalition government, but the coalition government is not working. And what we're seeing is a breakdown of governance in many parts of Afghanistan. The Americans last week said that something like 30% of Afghanistan is now under control of the Taliban. And the rest of it is being very poorly governed. The third reason I will give is the economic crisis. Unfortunately, all these years that NATO and the Americans were there, they did not really establish an internal economy that could provide income for the Afghan state. Afghanistan needs about $10 billion a year. And at the moment, almost 90% of this money comes from the donor community, from the West. It needs $5 billion to maintain the army and about $5 billion for the budget of the state. And Afghanistan itself only provides about 400 million. So about 90% is dependent on Western support. And frankly, with what is happening in the world with Syria and the Middle East and Iraq, it is very unlikely that Western support for Afghanistan is going to continue for very long. Fourthly, is the interference of all the neighboring states. Afghanistan is landlocked. It has 5 neighbors, and all of them, and all the near neighbors and the faraway neighbors are all interfering. Pakistan has given sanctuary to the Taliban leadership since 1993. And even after 9/11, when Pakistan was helping the Americans, they were still not really pushing the Taliban out of Pakistan. And even though the Pakistan army has gone up against local terrorists, Pakistani terrorists, it has not done anything about the sanctuary that the Afghan Taliban leadership has in Pakistan. Iran is now hosting Taliban in quite substantial numbers. And a lot of Western Afghanistan, which borders Iran, is controlled by the Taliban, who are supported by Iran. Russia, China, the Central Asian republics are all dealing now with the Taliban, because many of these countries are expecting, if not a Taliban victory, Taliban successes on the battlefield. And they all want to be in touch with the Taliban. And obviously, this is a great danger for the Afghan government. Now, last year, there was the hope that Pakistan had raised the issue of holding talks between the Taliban and the Kabul government, and there was a group that was set up called the Quadruple Group, which consisted of America, China, Pakistan, and the Afghan government. And there was only one meeting with the Taliban, but after that, this efforts at diplomacy have also collapsed. And part of the reason for that has been, unfortunately, the lack of international attention, the lack of European initiatives, the lack of American attention. President Obama just wants to pass his time out. He doesn't want to get involved in trying to promote a dialogue between the Afghan government and the Taliban. So if briefly, let me touch on the state of the Taliban. Well, you know, the Taliban have survived 15 years of a Western presence. And they... Sorry. All right, okay. And, you know, the Taliban were completely defeated after 9/11 when the Americans invaded. And they have been, many of them retreated into Pakistan, and they have re-established themselves and now have control of almost 3 provinces in Afghanistan. And there's a real fear that if a province falls into their hands, or the capital of a province falls into Taliban hands, there will be a complete collapse of the government and the army, and more territory will fall into the hands of the Taliban. But at the same time, it must be said that the Taliban are also very badly divided. There are many groups within the Taliban who don't accept the present leadership. I won't go into the details of this leadership struggles that have happened in the Taliban, but the last 2 or 3 years, there have been several leadership changes, and some Taliban, don't accept that. Why the Taliban, let me just say that unlike Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Taliban remain an Afghan force. They want to conquer Afghanistan. They want to rule Afghanistan again. They have never been involved in global jihad. They have never been involved in promoting terrorism in the West. But the real danger for the for the West with the Taliban is that they have given sanctuary to many militant groups. For example, Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan under their protection. Central Asian groups, Chechens, Chinese Muslims, Pakistani groups. So we have multiple groups from the region who are fighting with the Taliban and have taken shelter there. And certainly if the Taliban take more territory, we will see an expansion of all these groups' activities. Even if there's a dialogue tomorrow between the Afghan government and the Taliban, what is going to happen to these groups? How will the Taliban deal with them? How will the international community deal with them? Because they are a very strong presence on Afghan soil. And this is the danger, that even though the Taliban are not international jihadists, they are giving sanctuary to many militant groups. So Afghanistan, as I said, remains largely ignored by the West. And unfortunately, we've been through this process already. After 9/11, Americans and NATO sent troops into Afghanistan. But in 2003, the Americans literally abandoned Afghanistan and went to Iraq and invaded Iraq. And for several years, there was no economic development in Afghanistan. There was no nation building. There was no money for anything. Of course, the Taliban used this period to re-emerge. And we are once again seeing the ignoring of Afghanistan by the Western community and the international community as a whole. And we are seeing the re-emergence of the Taliban. Let me, having talked about Afghanistan, let me also tell you that ISIS is trying to make a foothold in Afghanistan. It has a presence in 3 provinces in Afghanistan. It is not very popular, but it is anti-Taliban. So what we are seeing is that many of the Afghan fighters who are angry with the Taliban for one reason or the other are actually joining ISIS. So the fragmentation of the Taliban is helping ISIS. And this, of course, I don't think ISIS will establish such a presence as they have in Syria and Iraq, but it's a huge danger that the fact that ISIS has arrived in Afghanistan and, I may say, in Pakistan as well, it's a huge danger that Afghanistan, of course, could provide a sanctuary for ISIS if ISIS is defeated in Syria or driven out of Syria and Iraq. So the ISIS presence is small. It is being fought by the Americans and by the Afghan army and also by the Taliban, because the Taliban know that ISIS is giving is a great danger to their own control of the Islamist movement in Afghanistan. Now, ISIS, of course, is basically a Middle East phenomenon. It has emerged from the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it has taken enormous territory in Iraq and Syria and is trying to do the same in Libya. The crisis for the Middle East is that we have at least 4 failed states. Yemen, in which there's a very vicious civil war going on, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, which is completely fragmented. ISIS is in all these countries. It is trying to make a foothold in all these 4 countries, but so is Al-Qaeda. And there's competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS in all of these countries. ISIS's appeal has been largely to younger Muslims, many of them in the West. Since 2011, some 42,000 foreigners from 120 countries have joined ISIS and are fighting for ISIS in Syria and Iraq. That's a huge amount. That is far more than, for example, the number of foreigners who came to join the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. It's far more than those who came to join Al-Qaeda. 42,000 fighters from 122 countries, including 7,600 Westerners, meaning Europeans and Americans. And that is the estimate so far. And I give you one more figure, which has been, which is to do with Syria, which is that in 5 years, something like 500,000 people have been killed in Syria. And there are over 1.9 million wounded. These figures over just 5 years are far more than, for example, what Afghanistan has experienced or what other countries like Iraq and others have experienced. There are 11 million displaced people who have come out of Syria. 4 million of them have come out of Syria. 7 million have been displaced internally. So there is a huge catastrophe, and much of this has been caused by ISIS. Now, nevertheless, I do believe that ISIS at the moment is on the retreat. And I think one of the key things we should understand is that they have been losing territory in Iraq and in Syria. And in Syria, this is not so much to do with the victories of President Assad and his Russian allies, but has more to do with the anti-ISIS Islamist forces. And those anti-ISIS forces includes Al-Qaeda. So you have a very complicated situation where ISIS is being driven back into retreat by the forces of the government, the President Bashar al-Assad, and his Russian and Iranian allies, as well as by the Islamist forces. So the loss of territory has also meant a loss of their economic base. Remember, a year ago, they were controlling hundreds of oil wells. They were selling oil to many countries in the Middle East. They had huge income. They were also taxing the population with Islamic taxes. They have lost a lot of those oil wells, which have been either destroyed by the Americans or they have been retaken. And they have also lost a lot of the population that they were taxing. So their economic funding, a lot of it has dried up. And so unfortunately, what I'm seeing is that as ISIS is pushed back and it loses more territory to these other groups, there are a couple of major problems that emerge. The first is that ISIS may abandon Syria. It may be forced to leave Syria, but it will increase terrorism in the West. One way of continuing to establish its presence and continuing to make itself attractive to young people is the fact that it will launch more and more terrorist attacks in Europe and the US if it can. And of course in the Arab world, and we've already seen now a spate of attacks in Baghdad because the Iraqi army is also having some success against ISIS. So that's the first thing. ISIS, and secondly, there is absolutely no agreement as to what will happen to Syria even if ISIS is defeated. We have no plan, there is no thinking going on, there is no unity between Russia and America, between all the elements of the international community, within the Arab world even. There is no thinking as to what is going to happen to Syria. Will it just end up being a fragmented country with many different warlords who will be ruling over different parts of Syria? That will be unacceptable, because that will only promote more extremism, and ISIS can then make a comeback. But certainly we cannot have Assad, who's murdered his own people in such large numbers. So there is this real problem as to how Syria is going to evolve, and there's very little thinking on this. Of course, how can they be when there's no agreement even on humanitarian convoys coming into Syria from outside? Secondly, I will say that I think increasingly the beliefs of ISIS, how ISIS has perverted Islam and reinterpreted Islam, I think that is becoming unsustainable in the Muslim world. Yes, young people are joining ISIS. Yes, young people are seduced by Twitter and by Facebook and by ISIS executions and all this. But ISIS has so perverted Islamic teaching, even more than Al-Qaeda, that I think this is finally becoming unsustainable. And I think one of the problems that we are faced with in the Muslim world is the lack of a Muslim leadership in providing an alternative narrative to what is going on with ISIS. This is the moment when ISIS is in retreat, where I think you need a powerful voices in the Muslim world explaining that this kind of Islam that they are promoting is nonsense. And finally, I think the ISIS experiment with trying to build a Khilafat, this was trying to build a new kind of Islamic State out of all the Middle East, putting it all together and creating a new state. This is clearly not working, and this has also failed. ISIS said that it wanted to bring in professionals, engineers, architects to build this new Islamic State, and it's not working. So broadly, I will say that ISIS is on the retreat, but there is so much confusion about and so much dissension between Russia and America, within the Arab world, as to what will follow, that unfortunately, even if ISIS is defeated, we are still going to see enormous problems, including, of course, stepped up terrorism in the West. Now, let me touch on Al-Qaeda. 5 years after the death of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda is back in a very big way. And it is expanding in Africa, in Asia, and is now another contender for power in the Middle East, in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, as well as North Africa. Now, one thing Al-Qaeda has done, remember Al-Qaeda under bin Laden was a very centralized body. All the planning and the expansion around the world was done through a centralized group which was based in Pakistan, Afghanistan. Now, Al-Qaeda has been much more practical than ISIS. It has given franchises to various groups in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And that centralized control has been decentralized. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, the present leader of Al-Qaeda, has basically given permission for these groups to operate on their own. Now, that has really allowed Al-Qaeda to present themselves not so much as global jihadists, but more as jihadists within a region or within a country. For example, if you see Boko Haram in Nigeria, or if you see the groups in the Sahel and North Africa, many of these groups have pledged loyalty to Al-Qaeda, but they are actually pursuing their own program and their own agenda for their region. And most importantly, Al-Qaeda in Syria, which used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra, they have actually seek permission from Al-Qaeda to leave Al-Qaeda. And they have engaged now in trying to form a broad front of all the Islamist extremist groups in Syria to fight Assad. So this is a very different strategy that Al-Qaeda has adopted now in the Muslim world. It is decentralized. It has allowed, if you like, localism and regionalism to come into this idea. It is not pushing the idea of a caliphate. It thinks it's too premature to do this. And it is encouraging local groups to take their own initiative, to raise their own money and funding. However, it is still very much wanting to target the United States and the West. Al-Qaeda still believes that it can, before it can set up a caliphate or before it can dominate a country in the Muslim world, it needs to destroy America, destroy Europe, etc. So, but Al-Qaeda, I think, is playing a long game, a much longer game than ISIS, and in fact, for that reason, it is much more dangerous in the long term. But Al-Qaeda will, I think, make a comeback because of it is a far more political and strategic and practical organization than ISIS. Remember, you have now Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. You've got Al-Qaeda in West Africa. You've got Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And you've got Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Just, so we can see how it is trying to evolve and attract people by raising local issues and attacking local regimes rather than trying to establish this whole idea of a global jihad. Now, I just want to touch very quickly on when I talk about the misinterpretation of Islam. Let me just say, the widespread use of jihad came into being during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when the West supported a jihad against the Soviet Union. And the CIA and or the Western intelligence agencies encouraged Muslims to come and fight for the Mujahideen and to kill Russian troops, and this was considered to be a jihad. So it is not that, the whole world has been guilty in part for re-establishing jihad. Where Al-Qaeda breaks off from this, and Osama bin Laden introduces his ideology, is to make jihad synonymous with being the most important aspect of Islam. Now, jihad, Islam has 5 pillars of belief, five beliefs that you have to believe in if you're going to be a Muslim. Jihad is not one of them. Jihad is not compulsory for Muslims to do. Yet Osama bin Laden made jihad the #1 item in being a good Muslim meant you had to do jihad. This was nonsense. This had nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with the Quran. Secondly, he made jihad as an offensive, an instrument to conquer territory, to kill people. Jihad, even in the interpretation in the Quran, is a defensive mechanism. It is supposed to protect Muslims from being attacked from outside. And it is also, the interpretation is that it is also used as a struggle for individuals to become better people, better citizens of the world. And so Osama changed this whole thing around and made jihad the primary factor for being a good Muslim. And those Muslims who didn't believe in jihad as being that important, Al-Qaeda killed. ISIS, of course, has taken this even further. ISIS has claimed that all the minorities, the non-Muslim minorities, can be killed and executed. ISIS has endorsed slavery of women, which, is complete nonsense because the Prophet Muhammad actually freed his slaves at that time in Arabia. And slavery, is not something that is practiced by any Muslim country today. And even the idea of the Caliphate. The fact is that the Caliphate is a very mythical political establishment. When the Prophet died, there was no political system that he left in place. It was up to the followers who followed him to create that political system. There was no explicit description of a caliphate that had to be created after he died. There was no political manifesto for the future. So Al-Qaeda has been, if you like, the ideological base for ISIS. And except that ISIS has taken it to an extreme. And of course, the worst thing that ISIS has done has been to increase the bloodshed between Sunni and Shia. ISIS believes that only those who follow the Wahhabi sect of Sunni Islam, which is what is practiced in Saudi Arabia, are really good Muslims. All other non-Muslims can be executed, killed, imprisoned, made into slaves. And even Muslims who are Shia, who are not Sunni, can also be killed. And unfortunately, what we are faced with in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and other places, is this terrible violence now that is going on between Sunni and Shia. And this really is the responsibility of the Muslim world to deal with. It is not a responsibility of the West to deal with. And that message, unfortunately, is not getting out. That, just recently there was the Hajj, and the Saudis did not allow any Iranians to perform the Hajj. And of course, the Sunni-Shia conflict has taken on a Saudi-Iran conflict. The Saudi has the support of the Gulf Arabs and other Arab states, and Iran has the support of Shias around the world, particularly in Iraq. So, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the ideology that was set in motion by Osama bin Laden, which was itself a complete perversion of Islam, has been now taken to another extreme by ISIS. And we can deal with ISIS militarily, I'm sure, in the years to come. The question is, how is the world going to deal with the ideology of ISIS? How are Muslims going to cope with that and diminish this false ideology of ISIS, which I think is still not being properly tackled. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Muchas gracias, Ahmed Rashid, por esta brillante ponencia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid, for your brilliant speech, where you have told us about the three jihadist groups and several background problems like the lack of a solid economy in the case of Afghanistan, and also in many of these states, let's say rogue states, where there is no government that brings alternatives to youth. He was speaking about the attraction of the Daesh message among the youth, and the alternative that has not been provided by the Muslim world. And no matter how old the Daesh message could be, and he has also spoken about the failure of the international community when it came to stopping the problem and not letting it expand. And like in the case of Afghanistan, when they have withdrawn the troops before the right time, and this has left a government void with terrible consequences, and how and when to deal with actors that are non-government actors is also a question that we might raise for Mr. Rashid, because we know that the Taliban could even have an embassy in Doha, and I think that it was very important what he mentioned about the jihad, that it's not one of the 5 Islam pillars, and the interpretation of the jihad on the side of the Salafists and other extreme groups, extremist groups, does not correspond to the right definition of jihad. But we're going to leave the floor now to Ms. Pilar Requena. She is going to give us some comments about what Mr. Rashid has told us. Good afternoon. Thank you, Casa Arabe, for having me here today. It's very difficult for me to say anything after Mr. Rashid, whom I consider to be my master about Pakistan and Afghanistan through his books and the many interviews and conversations that we have had, and besides our personal friendship. But instead of commenting on what he has said, I would like to highlight certain points that he has mentioned in the first place. Karim, I would like to highlight the forgetfulness in which Pakistan has fallen. That came about after the Syrian conflict exploded, which is one of the main failures by the international community, and it's also a failure that Afghanistan has been forgotten, because it will bounce back as it did in the previous civil war in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and we seem to have forgotten completely about this. About the withdrawal of international troops, I think it's very serious, this in Afghanistan, not only because it was a fake withdrawal, because they actually announced, Mr. Obama actually announced when the troops were going to be withdrawn from the country, so the Taliban and the rest of the insurgent groups only had to wait in the mountains for the international troops to abandon the country to jump in. Another of the big mistakes that we can see is forgetting forgetting Afghanistan and invading Iran in 2003, when they were really in need of a state in Afghanistan that needed to be put in place, because as we see afterwards, the government became a failed government. So the national community government in Afghanistan, has it really worked? This is actually allowing the Taliban to gather more and more power in the country. The Taliban, I don't know if dealing with the Taliban would be the real answer to solve all the problems in the country, and I hope Rashid would give us an answer about this later. And after all we have done about fighting the Taliban, could the Taliban be a minor danger when compared to the possible expansion of ISIS into the area, and maybe the possible look for a sanctuary in Afghanistan, and after the potential failure of ISIS in Iran and Syria, after the international troops withdrew from the country, they have been trying to expand towards Pakistan and other areas, and they have not managed. And one of the reasons why they don't manage to do it is because they cannot get the Taliban support, because they still have a local agenda against the global agenda of the ISIS group. And also, even though they're using these franchises in the rest of the world, one of the big questions for Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan is the Russian role. We're turning them into the bad guys of this movie, as if Putin were the worst of all evils, when without Russia, these problems cannot be solved. Syria, Russia is supporting Iran and Syria, and they will not stop supporting them. Russia is also interested in not having ISIS expand towards Pakistan and Afghanistan, because this could mean that they would enter the republics in the area, and that would mean fighting the Russians and also linking with the jihadist groups in the Russian territory. Also, China is interested in not seeing an expansion of ISIS towards Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, as Ahmed has mentioned, there are many states involved And the issue is how the international community is going to face this issue and include the whole of this community that needs to start negotiating, because what's happening right now is a real shame, a historic shame for all of us, what's going on in Syria and what has also happened in Afghanistan in the previous years. And that not going really into the details of what's going on in Pakistan, which is a country that is a key country in solving the problems of the area, and it's also on the verge of becoming a rogue state. Probably Mr. Rajid can describe Pakistan better, but also the Pakistani Taliban are not really linked with the Afghanistan Taliban, because we tend to look at them all together and mix them all up, and all the jihadist groups, we're mixing them all when each of them has their own ideas. They even fight among each other, against each other. And for instance, Pakistan does not support the Iran Taliban and wanting to fight the Pakistan Taliban as well. So it's, if we have actually closed our intervention in Afghanistan, if we ever closed it, has only complicated the situation. If ISIS enters Afghanistan, that's a big concern. It doesn't look like this is going to happen because of the forces that are running right now and acting within Afghanistan, and also because they do not find the favor among the Afghanistan population, and although there have been some Taliban who have joined the ISIS forces, this has been very scattered, and not the whole Taliban group have joined or wanted to connect with ISIS. But maybe the Taliban could be the ones who block the ISIS expansion towards Afghanistan. So is it an option for us to give power or to allow the Taliban to hold power in Afghanistan so that they could block the advances of ISIS into the country, if they really attempt to get into the country, if they are finally defeated in Iran or Syria? Or should we try to look at it in a more optimistic way and think that after their defeat in Iran and Syria, and if Al-Qaeda also comes back, and because we were all focused in ISIS and we forgot completely about Al-Qaeda, they were placed everywhere, and they're just waiting for ISIS to leave them the floor and to become the protagonists again. I don't want to be very pessimistic, but it looks like we have still many years ahead when we will have to face different groups like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. ISIS may be transformed or mutate into something different with a different name, but as long as the international community doesn't take it seriously to deal with jihadism, including the Muslim community, and unless we all row in the same direction, I think that after Iraq and Syria, we will, and we have forgotten about Libya, that is also an ongoing problem that is about to blow up. And when this issue blows in our faces, we will truly understand what that wrong intervention on the part of the international community in Afghanistan will represent for the whole of us, until the United States and Russia find an agreement or because we have seen that if they do not find an agreement, or if they still miss to agree on a little point, we see that it's very easy that everything will act as a little sparkle that would set the whole thing on fire again. It seemed like everyone was waiting for the other one to fail so that the negotiations would get to a right end, and rather to a sticky end. I think it's Mr. Rashid who would be probably closer to finding an answer to all these questions. But I think that the main concern for me is what would happen and how the international community would think, what they would think about the Taliban's holding power in Afghanistan. I would like you to thank you, Pilar, and please keep this question about the Taliban's ruling Afghanistan as a possible solution for dealing with ISIS. This could be compared maybe with the current situation, and because those who are fighting ISIS need to belong to a nation that is stronger than the Daesh offer of this mythical side of the caliphate, or that ideal region that encompasses Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Kurdistan, etc. I don't know if the Taliban's, and Indonesia as well, I don't know if maybe these Talibans could offer, just as the Peshmerga in the Kurdistan offer the possibility of fighting the Daesh. If you could write this question for later, I would like to give the floor now to Rubén Campo from Club de Madrid. We had foreseen to give him the floor.
Vale. Pues buenas tardes, y mi nombre es Rubén Campos y trabajo.
Good afternoon, I'm Rubén Campos. I'm the coordinator of Club de Madrid, an organization of ex-worldwide leaders that work towards democracy. We've been working with terrorism and extreme violence for quite some time. Thank you to Casa Árabe for their initiative. It's a privilege to have one of the most respected analysts here with us, as Professor Rashid and of course Pilar, who is a great expert in Afghanistan and Pakistan and all this context. And I also wanted to congratulate Casa Árabe for their translations of Mr. Rashid's works into Spanish, where it helps a lot of us. My comment would have to do with one of the items that you've mentioned, is the need of building some sort of strategy or counter-narrative to face the narratives that have been spread out by ISIS. We need to counterattack this. We have some institutions or organizations in the Arab world that are working towards this narrative, but which political leaders could lead this effort? That would be my question. It's difficult to find Arab states that could be seen as leaders for others. We've got Iran, Saudi Arabia, a lot of interest, maybe Tunisia with the transition and consensus between different stakeholders. Maybe this would be a way forward to be able to build this counter-narrative. But Tunisia, as I was saying, has to face very strong economic difficulties, and if they don't find answers to these difficulties for their population, and as Professor Rashid was saying, a part of this population of foreign fighters that have joined ISIS come from Tunisia. This can be seen, this youth, as Karim was saying, that doesn't have an access to work or future, can be attracted by this narrative. Maybe Indonesia, there's also a Muslim country that is an example in many ways with regard to democracy, economics, but maybe it's too far away from these other countries of the Middle East. That might be a possibility, and I don't know if Mr. Rashid can identify other forces that are not necessarily state, but stakeholders that might be able to lead this counter-narrative. And finally, as Pilar has mentioned, maybe if you could reflect on Pakistan a little bit, that you know so well, it would be interesting to see how the groups that you've mentioned are currently acting, and what are the possibilities with regard to the future.
Ahmed, ¿quieres responder?
Ahmed, you have the floor.
Let me just raise a couple of quick points. We have not talked about the refugee crisis in Europe, but obviously it is of incredible importance, and Europe has not come up with any kind of solution. Spain has been very lucky because you have not been flooded with these refugees the way that Central Europe has been. But I want to make one point about the refugees, that the second largest number of refugees, the largest number is Syrian. The second is Afghan. And Germany right now is flooded with Afghan refugees. And these are Afghans who are educated Afghans, who were educated in the last 15 years during the presence of the Western forces, with the schools and money that went into education and all the rest of it. So almost the entire educated class of Afghans who emerged in the last 15 years have literally left the country. And there's almost nothing left, there's nobody left to build except uneducated people. And this is one of the really huge tragedies about this refugee crisis. And that is why even more the war in Afghanistan needs to be brought to an end so that these people can go back and help rebuild the country. The second issue is that, to be really clear, there are only two forces that are really fighting ISIS in Syria. The first force, are the Kurds. But nobody wants the Kurds to win, because the Kurds want to create their own state. And that is, but the Americans want to support the Kurds, but then Turkey gets angry, the Arabs get angry. Nobody wants to give up their territory for a Kurdish state. So that is one of the first contradictions that nobody has been able to deal with. The second group of people who are fighting ISIS in Syria are the other Islamic extremist groups led by Al-Qaeda. So if ISIS is defeated, we are going to be faced with having to deal with other Islamic groups who are not ISIS, but they owe their heritage to Al-Qaeda and other, So this is something really to think about. Because the future in Syria is not going to be a return to some kind of secular democracy or secular dictatorship like it was under Assad. It will be Islamist. And how are the Arabs and the West going to deal with that? The third thing I just want to mention about the counter-narrative. I mean, I think the points you make are really, extremely relevant. But the fact is that, my example from Afghanistan, the West educated tens of thousands of Afghans over 15 years after 9/11. And because of the lack of attention now, that whole generation is a lost generation. They're all sitting in refugee camps in Greece or Germany or the Balkans. So this is the problem. I mean, the counter-narrative needs to be supported with education, with jobs, with economic development, etc. But that is not happening because we are in a state of war in almost every country. And secondly, the counter-narrative needs, is coming from autocrats. I mean, the Arab world was ruled by dictators until the Arab Spring. And unfortunately, those dictators did not leave any kind of positive legacy regarding economic reforms, education, or anything else. And so there was this vacuum which Islamists have now filled. And so, we have to look at also the recent history. And of course, there are still kings ruling countries in the Arab world who are very autocratic and who have very strong beliefs like anti-Shias and anti-non-Muslims, etc. On the question of Pakistan, it has been, the last 2 years, there has been a campaign against, Pakistan has perhaps 60 to 70 Islamic extremist groups operating in the country. Many of these groups in the last 2 years have been killed or captured or dealt with. But two major groups have been left. The first is the groups in Punjab who are aimed at targeting in India and Kashmir in particular. As you know, there's a very widespread uprising in Kashmir right now, in Indian Kashmir. And recently there was an attack by a group of Kashmiris based in Pakistan who went across the border and attacked, and now there's huge tension between India and Pakistan. But the fact is that the Pakistan state, the government, the military have no desire to clean up these groups who are operating against India, because they are a kind of, if you like, a defense mechanism for the military and for the government against India, a threat, if you like. The other lot of groups, even though the army has literally wiped out the Pakistani Taliban or pushed a lot of them into Afghanistan, they have allowed the Afghan Taliban leadership to continue living in Pakistan. And I think this has been a huge mistake. Last year, when these talks started, we should have put pressure on the Afghan Taliban to make peace with Kabul and to leave the country. This is not sustainable. We cannot, in this day and age when terrorism is such a huge threat around the world, when the Taliban are a threat to the entire region, when the Taliban are hosting Al-Qaeda and Chechens and all these other groups, it is a huge risk that Pakistan is taking by hosting the Afghan Taliban. But all of this, unfortunately, is because of the India-Pakistan conflict. Pakistan, the government believes that India is becoming very powerful in Afghanistan, and that Pakistan will be surrounded by India and pro-Indian states, which is why it is refusing to deal with the issue of the Afghan Taliban. So it's very unfortunate that this is the state of play. And I fear that there could be catastrophic consequences. Remember, India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed states. Pakistan has all these jihadis still who are willing to go into Kashmir and fight in Kashmir. And India is talking about retaliation, military retaliation against Pakistan. All this is extremely, dangerous right now.
We're going to move to the Q&A part from the audience.
Thank you very much, Pilar. Well, normally our conferences last for 1 hour and a half. Normally at 8:30 we leave. This has been a little bit longer because having our two main guests, Mr. Rashid and Mrs. Regina, talking about this very interesting topic, the fragmentation, the lack of unity that we have in the Afghan government in regard to the Taliban's lack of unity in Europe. so as to be able to confront the refugee crisis. Here in Casa Árabe, we are interested in these topics to get to know the history, the reasons. Of course, we haven't been able to talk about Libya or Yemen with enough details because we have been focusing on the tragedy of Afghanistan and all the things that have happened there with regard to jihadist terrorism and the lack of clarity of the international community, the lack of strategy designed, because many of these decisions are tactical decisions and non-strategic. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the US without real plan with regard to the construction of the state and the power vacuum that entailed. All of this explains a lot of this extremism that we're seeing nowadays, the capacity that they have to adapt, the creation of alliances that we thought weren't possible. So I don't think we have any easy solutions, and the only thing that we can do is to try to talk to those who know the most about these things, experts that allow us to understand a little bit better, that communicate to the audiences all these questions that affect Europe, Spain, and Libya, for example, that were mentioned, and Syria. I just wanted to thank Ahmed Rashid and Pilar Requena, and thank you to all of you for attending this conference. And the people outside, thank you to the interpreters, and we invite you to follow our activities on the webpage casaarabe.es. Thank you very much.